Добрый день.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues and guests. Let me declare open the session of the Dissertation Council for the Defense of Thesis by Baranov Dmitry Kirillovich for the degree of Candidate of Philology, Specialization 100101 Russian Literature on the theme Communication Problems in the Prose of Sasha Sokolov and Sergey Dovlatov. According to the order number 7481 of St. Petersburg University, dated the 5th of July, 2019, me, Titarenko Svetlana Dmitry, Doctor of Philology, Associate Professor of Department of History, Russian Literature, St. Petersburg University, was appointed Chairman of this Dissertation Council. Let me also introduce our colleagues, Council members, Bolshoi Alexander Olegovich, Doctor of Philology, Professor of the Department of History of Russian Literature of St. Petersburg University. Bugaeva Lyubov Dmitrievna, Doctor of Philology, Associate Professor of the Department of Russian as a Foreign Language and the Teaching Methods at St. Petersburg University. Vera Leinin Maria Naumovna, Doctor of Philology, Professor, Chief Researcher of the Institute of Russian Literature, Pushkin House of the Russian Academy of Sciences. In the remote mode, we have Council Member Belobrovtseva Irina Zakharovna, Doctor of Philology, University of Tallinn, Estonia. First, let me emphasize that according to the federal law of the 23rd of August 1996, on science and the state scientific and technical policies, St. Petersburg University has the right to award academic degrees independently. A corresponding order on the procedure for awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University, on the basis of which we are holding this session of the Council, was issued on the 1st of September 2016. In accordance with this order, a session of a Dissertation Council is duly constituted if at least two-thirds of the approved members of the Council are participating, but not less than 4 persons. Our Dissertation Council consists of 5 members. All members are present, including 1 member in the remote interactive mode. The audio-visual contact has been established with her, thus that we have a quorum for the defense procedure. Let me set forth the procedure of today's session with a total duration of no more than 2 hours. Chairman's summary report on the main content of the documents submitted by the candidate and their compliance with the requirements. Documents are here, and answers to possible questions, 5 minutes. That shall be followed by a brief presentation by the degree applicant, outlining the key points of his research, up to 15 minutes. Questions to the applicant strictly on his report to be asked by council members and attendees, no more than 5 minutes per question, and answers of the applicant. Speeches of the members of the Dissertation Council with their reviews and statements of their opinions, questions and suggestions to the candidate, no more than 10 minutes for each speaker. Answers of the applicant to questions and remarks of members of the Dissertation Council, no more than 15 minutes. The open discussion, speeches of the attendees with the summary of their positions and all specific questions and suggestions to the candidates strictly on the topic of the study, no more than 5 minutes per speaker. At that, all the speakers are kindly requested to put their names on the registration sheet, which Ekaterina Vyacheslавna has over here, and introduce themselves in full before speaking. That shall be followed by the final answers of the candidate, no more than 5 minutes, the speech of the academic advisor, no more than 3 minutes, Andrei Dmitrovich Stepanov, a 5-minute discussion before the open voting on awarding or not awarding the academic degree to the candidate. That shall be followed by the open individual voting, and chairman shall count the votes, and the results shall be recorded in the minutes of the meeting. The decision on awarding or not awarding the academic degree that shall be followed by the closing remarks of the applicant, no more than 2 minutes. Before we start the official procedure, let me remind you to switch off your mobile phones. Thank you for your understanding. Let me also inform you that our meeting is being recorded and broadcast online at the university website, and the speeches are being simultaneously translated from Russian into English or from English into Russian. So, I shall now begin the meeting, and our first item, the chairman's summary report on the main contents of the documents submitted by the candidate. The thesis by Baranov Dmitry Kirillovich for the degree of candidate of philology, Specialization 10-0101 Russian literature, on the theme Communication Problems in the prose of Sasha, Sokolov and Sergey Dovlatov, was accepted for defense by the order of the Academic Secretary of St. Petersburg University on the 5th of July 2019, order number 7480/1. The Dissertation Council was appointed by the order of the Academic Secretary of St. Petersburg University on the 5th of July 2019, and I have already introduced its members to you, dear colleagues and guests. The applicant submitted the following documents to the Academic Secretary of St. Petersburg University: an application to the Rector of St. Petersburg University, Professor Nikolai Mikhailovich Kropotchev, for acceptance of the thesis for consideration and defense, submitted on the 26th of March 2019. A review by the academics advisor Stepanov Andrei Dmitryevich, Doctor of Philology, Professor of the Department of History of Russian Literature of St. Petersburg University. A list of 3 publications which set out the main scientific results of the thesis, including 2 articles in peer-reviewed scientific journals from the list approved by the Ministry of Education and Science of the Russian Federation, and 1 article in a journal indexed in the scientific databases Web of Science and Scopus. A certificate of candidate examination of the 19th March 2019 stating that Baranov Dmitry Kirillovich passed linguistics and literature with the following results: history and philosophy of science, philological sciences excellent, foreign language English excellent, Russian literature excellent. There's also a diploma on graduation from the postgraduate course issued on the 1st of August 2017 at the Petersburg University, certifying that Baranov Dmitry Kirillovich was awarded the qualification researcher, teacher-researcher, field of training Russian literature by the decision of the State Examination Commission of the 1st of July 2017. There's also the thesis in Russian and English in 2 volumes and right of manuscript. First volume is in Russian, second volume is in English, and in the electronic form. The thesis has been formatted in accordance with the requirements of State Standard GAST 7.0, printed on a multiplier with dedication of the output data. Should be noted that all documents listed above comply with Clause 12, Section 3, thesis presentation and defense, the procedure for awarding the academic degrees at St. Petersburg University. Does anyone have questions to the list of documents? Since no one has any questions, let's give the floor to the candidate, Dmitry Baranov, for his brief presentation. Can you hear me? Good afternoon, dear members of the Dissertation Council and dear guests. The topic of my dissertation, communication problems in the prose of Sasha, Sokolov, Sergey, Dovlatov. Relevance of the declared theme, as it seems to me, consists in the fact that the culture of the second half of the 20th century is only just beginning to be comprehended by science, and in the process, this comprehension is a important role played by the description of what literary strategies were used by significant authors of the epoch to build relations between the reader and the text. The main focus of my research is on the message of Receptive Aesthetics, according to which the existence of a literary text is largely due to the process of communication between the author and the reader. In this regard, I note in the introduction that Dissertation explores one of the possible systems of relations between text and reality, where the world depicted is related to the external reality through the process of reading the work by the recipient. I would also like to emphasize that I also rely on structural prose and narratology, taking into account the theories of formalism and some post-structuralists, such as researcher Bakhtin. The work consists of the introduction, 2 chapters, and the conclusion. The first chapter is dedicated to Sasha Sokolov's novel School for Fools. I demonstrate that in a novel where the protagonist faces problems interacting with other characters, Sokolov consciously problematizes the process of communication between the implicit author and the reader. If we describe a literary text as a statement, it turns out that Sokolov problematizes the code by introducing a mental ill context due to the reader has to make additional efforts to reconstruct the subject line, as well as the actual content. The text is simply difficult to perceive, including because the novel is constantly played out different communication situations. I demonstrate that the thematic dynamics in the novel School for Fools is achieved not at the expense of the development of the usual epic plot, but primarily through the changes in the motive system, which is more typical of the lyrics. Description of the dynamics of the novel by Sokolov is devoted to the first chapter of my study. I come to the conclusion that the readers involved in cooperation with the author and in the process of reading, he creates the text himself, which is fundamentally impossible in a system of social realism, realizes his freedom. This freedom is also expressed in the possibility of choosing one of the 2 permissible interpretations of the final text of the novel. According to the first, Sokolov hints at the possibility for the creator to go beyond the limits of the non-free world. According to the second, assess the impossibility of such an exit, impossibility of free love and creativity in the socialist culture. The second chapter of my thesis is devoted to the description of Dovlatov's poetics. I demonstrate how the author seeks to blur the boundaries between literary text and external reality through certain techniques, documentary games, and mythologization of his own biography. As a result, elements of a communication act, such as the code, context, address, and addressee, are problematized. I would like to emphasize one of the conclusions of the chapter, the effect of the recipient's recognition of reality depicted in the pre-Dovlatov's prose. The same effect largely determines the success of the author's readers is achieved not at the expense of the actual reliability, but at the expense of the fact that the text reproduces recognizable models of behavior, of heroes, or principles of development of a particular situation. Based on the ideas of Yurchak, I come to the conclusion that Dovlatov is interested in the performativity of the Soviet culture, the collision of an average person with a large number of ritualized everyday actions and statements. So the focus of the writer's attention is on the situation where the meaning of one or another statement is different from its form. This divergence in form of meaning determines the specific features of communication issues at the level of the world depicted. The main characters of Dovlatov's prose are aware of these problems, but they are themselves involved in the same rituals as the other characters, and their own speech is discredited. However, some pre-Dovlatov heroes try to rethink their own attitude to the world. Thus, the thesis demonstrates how communication issues are solved by the hero of the preserve. I come to the conclusion that by blurring the boundary between the literary text and reality, by returning to the meaningful with the debated world, can be perceived by the reader as an event affecting the real world. The conclusion summarizes my results. I note that both Dovlatov and Sokolov are aware of the communication issues playing a crucial role in external reality. These problems, typical for their epoch, are reflected in the artistic text at the level of the depicted world. At the same time, both authors problematize the very process of communication between the implicit author and the reader. In such a situation, the recipient's overcoming of the communicative difficulties in the process of reading becomes the most important event, echoing what's happening at the level of the depicted world. Thus, Dovlatov and Sokolov give the reader a hint at the possibility of solving these issues in external reality. The main results and conclusions of my thesis have been tested in international conferences, reflected in articles in peer-reviewed scientific journals recommended by Suprematization Committee of the Russian Federation. Novelty of my work is in the fact that there are no major studies to understand how the aggravation of communicative problems in the late 20th century are reflected in fiction. The texts of Sokolov and Dovlatov have not been studied from the chosen angle of view. It would be good to nice to believe that the research has both theoretical significance, is processed to lead off the second half of the capital for the first time, and practical significance. The offered description of principles of interaction of the text with the recipient can be further used in by other working with other texts. Of course, I can speak a lot about my study, but that is why I'd like to save your time, maybe answer your questions in more detail, and so I look forward to a fruitful discussion. Thank you for your attention. Does anyone have questions to the candidate? No one has any questions. According to the procedure, reviews, including the external review, shall be followed by reviews. We have no external reviews. That's why I would like to give the floor to the council members. Let's start with the review of Alexander Olegovich Bolshev, Doctor of Philology, Department of History of the Russian Literature. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. The communication issues in the thesis by Baranov. The presentation is different from a traditional approach of his academic advisor. His attention is drawn to the one of the possible system of interaction between text and reality, where text corresponds to reality through the very process of perception. So we look at a study where the cornerstone, as was already mentioned, is the receptive aesthetics, according to which existence of literary text is largely determined by the process of communication between the author and the reader. Selection of prose by Sasha, Sokolov and Sergey Dovlatov is explained by the fact that both contemporaries, according to the author, played important to the fact of communications, believe that all communication problems are central for the culture of their time. In the theoretical view, Mr. Baranov studies the very process of dynamic creation of meaning of literary text in the process of contact. This methodological approach, first of all, explains relevance and novelty of the thesis by Dmitry Kirillovich Baranov. The thesis is dedicated to the work of two authors and includes introduction, conclusion, and 2 chapters. The first chapter, the author analyzes a novel by Sasha Sokolov, School for Fools. Dmitry Kirillovich proves that specific dynamic structure of Sokolov's novel is close to Gogol poetics. The authors means Petersburg novels, where the borders between the hero and the external world is one. Indeed, Bashmachkin in the military code becomes an item of Petersburg mythology. In the similar world as the first chapter, the author is fold in the plays a significant role, the School for Fools. And Dmitry Kirillovich then focuses on the phenomenon of interaction, and divided into many roles. This principle is also similar to Gogol. In this case, the author maybe overestimates the influence of Gogol. So the problem of duality, as the general situation of the inner loss of his own identity, can hardly be limited solely to the framework of Gogol's work. The most interesting section of the first chapter is devoted to the role of epigraphs in the Sokolov's novel. Here, a very interesting intertextual analysis has been created, throwing light on the problem of split personality, which, according to Baranov, plays a key role in the School of Fools. In the course of review analyzing the epigraphs, the researcher comes to the conclusion that Nympheus not only follows the teachings of his teacher Saul, but also outgrows his mentor, overcoming his hatred for evil. This section is devoted to speech as the semantic center of the character image, as well as the caricature of game in the novel School for Fools are also very informative. In general, it seems that analysis of Sasha Sokolov's novel, The School for Fools, is the deepest in the modern scientific literature devoted to this text. The second chapter of the thesis deals mainly with Sergey Dovlatov's book, The Preserve. Here, Dmitry Kirillovich raises the question about the principles and trends that characterize Dovlatov's reception. Within the framework of the category of reality, Dovlatov's Baranov draws attention to the repetition or rather variation of the pre-Dovlatov texts of almost identical situations, seeing this as a universal constructive principle which is used by the author of The Preserve. Of great interest are the observations of the specificity of Dovlatov's humor, as well as analysis of errors that are abundant in poetic quotations appearing in Dovlatov's work. According to the candidate, these errors are connected with Dovlatov's accentuations on the cause of interrelations of lies and creativity. Proceeding from this message about the performative nature of Soviet reality, Dmitry Kirillovich considers the pre-Dovlatov world under an appropriate answer, discovering that, first of all, is a set of specific idealized rituals in which the hero takes part in one way or another. During the analysis of this book, The Preserve, the candidate pays much attention to the narrative aspects of the text. Consideration profound play with the reader's expectation, especially characteristic of dialogues. The candidate explores the nature of the communicative failures and crises arising in the pre-Dovlatovian psychological hero. The plot and semantic dynamics of the book, The Preserve, is interpreted as a process of becoming the total communication crisis experienced by the hero, and where the final one is a triumph of communication. The thesis contains all the necessary conclusions and generalizations, and all the provisions put forth for defense are fully justified and proved in the course of the analysis. The thesis is independent and demonstrates both a thorough knowledge of the sources and the possession of scientific approaches that allow the analytical review of literary material. The results of examination of Dmitry Baranov's dissertation in the absence of illegal borrowings. Any questions and comments that arise during the analysis of the thesis do not diminish the importance of the research, which deserves the highest praise and recognition of the scientific community. The results of this scientific research are of great interest not only in the historical and literary but also in the general theoretical sense. First of all, the principles of analysis of dynamic process of meaning. The fact that the author reader has been engaged in a dialect. In the thesis, the problem of communication in the process of Sasha Sokolov and Sergey Dovlatov, submitted for the degree of candidate of philological sciences, specialization 10-0101 Russian literature, meets the basic requirements established by the order, the 1st of September 2016, number 6821/1, on the order of awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University. And the candidate, Dmitry Kirillovich Baranov, deserves to be awarded the degree of candidate of philology in specializations 10-0101 Russian literature. Clause 11 of this order has not been violated by the candidate. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Alexander Olegovich. Let me now let's give the floor to Lyubov Dmitrievna Bugaeva, Doctor of Philology, Professor, Department of Teaching Russian as Foreign Language, in the thesis of problems of communication and process such Sokolov arise in both at the level of the subject world and in the interaction of the reader and the text. Dmitry Baranov draws connections between the ways of building relations between the text and the reader and communicating the culture of a certain historical period. Having chosen Sasha, Sokolov and Sergey as a subject of research for the epoch of communicative problems, problematization of the process of reading itself, and the connection between the communication of characters and the communication of explicit authors and readers, Dmitry Baranov investigates one of the possible systems of relations between text and reality. The world is depicted as the external reality through the process of reading by the recipient of the work, and tries to find out what ways of building such relationship between the text and the reader have been used by Russian authors. It should be noted that the applicant has been successful. Baranov convincingly proves that his research, that the author's attitude to conscious problematizations of the process of text communication with the reader, is present in the works of Sokolov and Dovlatov. The scientific novelty of the research is the combination of communicative problems of the text and historical and literary motivational analysis. The position seems to be correct, according to which a special role belongs to the study of the dynamics of the development of the meaning of the work, through which is impossible to analyze the process of communication between the text and the reader. A big part of the introduction to the chapter's conclusion is a fundamental and significant achievement of the dissertation. Dmitry Baranov sets himself a number of complex tasks, the solution of which allows him to identify the distinctive characteristics of the prose, such as Sokolov and Sergey Dovlatov. Thus, in the first chapter of his thesis, Baranov describes, for example, ways of problematizing the plot and the character, including organization of the motive structure, the role of epigraphs, and the voice of the character. In the second chapter, Baranov, turning to Dovlatov's prose, considers the relationship between the text and the extra-text reality. The logic of presentation and analysis of the material under consideration is natural as a progress from attitude to word play with the reader. In my opinion, the sections of this chapter that consider Dovlatov's work in the light of performative shift in the Soviet culture are extremely interesting. Baranov comes to a conclusion that one of the central themes of Dovlatov's work arising is a response to the performative nature of the surrounding culture, turns out to be disclosure of violations of the relationship between the signifying and the signified. The study contains many interesting findings and subtle observations of the artistic world, including those related to the relationship between the meaning and the signified. In general, it's necessary to know the structure of the conceptual canvas, that is the breadth, the subtle observation, the persuasiveness of the interpretations, the penetration into the depths of the reader's perception, disclosure, the mechanisms of such penetration. In the analytical sections of his work, demonstrates the applicability of his theoretical provisions to the studies of prose as of postmodernism, the origin of which he sees in the School of Fools by Sasha, Sokolov, and postmodernism. Along with the undoubted advantage of the thesis, there are several discussion points. Thus, Baranov believes that the separation of the narrative strategies away for the reader to read is a productive way of analyzing text based on the game with the reader. However, any reader who has been transferred to the world of the work, in Richard Garrick's terminology, is not only the reader text based on the game with him, act as a traveler and makes mental operations during his travel, allowing him to interpret what he has read. And finally, such reader returns to the world from which he has left being changed, as Garrick says, applicable not only to the author, but also to the author's assertion that the readers maximally involved in the creation with the author and in the process of reading creates the text itself, which is fundamentally impossible in the system of socialist realism, realizes his freedom. Mikhail Berg, in his work, introduced the concept of internal immigration, which regards the replacement for one field of effort where the success of a social agent has not succeeded or succeeded in a volume that doesn't correspond to his ambitions, the other field in which he expects success. It's possible that Sasha Sokolov's chosen communication strategy was an attempt to create such a space for internal immigration. Some bewilderment is caused by the critical literature from his exclusion from the list of critical who studied such Sokolov and Sergey Dovlatov, such as Cynthia Simmons and Elena Kravchenko, both published in English. It should be noted that Dmitry Kirillovich Baranov avoids discussion of the concepts of complicated reception, complicated form of Viktor Shklovsky. According to Shklovsky, the difficulty causes confusion in the reader due to the inconsistency of the text to the system of audience expectations, which reduces the automatism of perception. Yuri Mikhailovich Lotman discovers the sculpture of the literary text, the simultaneous work of the two opposite mechanisms, the automation of perception and its de-automation. In his Jean Epstein describes 7 properties of the work that destroy automatism of perception. In modern research, term counter-communication strategy is often used to denote communication in the world. Are those notions comparable to what Dmitry Baranov understands by communication problems or issues? However, the comments do not reduce assessment of the dissertation research by Dmitry Baranov. The work presented here is theoretically valuable tool for further study of the latest and current Russian literature. It is a serious study that testifies to the independence of thinking, theoretical maturity and erudition of the dissertation. Reliability of the results is proved by the theoretical methodological base of the research, evidentiary analysis of the works of Sasha, Sokolov and Sergey Dovlatov. The thesis by Dmitry Kirillovich Baranov on theme communication problems in the prose of Sasha, Sokolov and Sergey Dovlatov meets the basic requirements established by the order on the degree of awarding degrees in St. Petersburg University, and the candidate Baranov Dmitry Kirillovich deserves to be awarded the degree of candidate of philology, specialization 10-0101 Russian literature. Clause 11 of the said order has not been violated by the candidate. Thank you. Thank you, Lubov Dmitrievna. Now let's hear a review by Maria Naumovna Virlainin, Doctor of Philology, Senior Researcher of Institute of Russian Literature, Pushkin's dissertation by Dmitry Kirillovich Baranov is devoted to the problems of communication, and that gives me the opportunity to say at once that communication with such a reader as Dmitry Kirillovich would be a dream for any author. However, the philological attention to the text that is shown by the author does not lose sight of the subtlest nuances, nor the whole story. To analyze the relationship between the text and external reality, the relationship that develops in the course of reading, the two authors have been chosen, intentionally problematizing the process of communication with the reader, but carrying it out by directly opposite means. Sasha Sokolov obviously complicates such communication, and Dovlatov creates deceptive simplicity. Following Tunyanov's teachings about the plot dynamics, which is formed by the interaction between the movement of the plot and the movement of the stylistic masses, the candidate uses a paradoxical but unexpectedly justified method. He analyzes the school for fools, isolating in this epic work a lyrical plot based on the development and alternation of motives. Dmitry Baranov shows that when reading the Sokolov's novel, the reader is required to abandon the perception of the text as an analog of external reality and to follow the dynamics of the motivational system, which serve as the main mediator between the text and what's out of the ordinary. The prototype of such poetics is found in Gogol's work. The work demonstrates with great subtlety that Sasha Sokolov, just like Gogol, has not only objects but also characters that are not outlined by a clear line, which allows them to see the mimetic semblance of concrete realities of the outside world. Characters lose their autonomy, the boundaries between them are erased, and the event that happened to one of them can turn into an event in the life of the other. Heroes dissolve in the text, in the movement of the verbal masses, which in fact is the subject life of the text. But from the same linguistic reality of the narrator, Sokolov's heroes are born and gain independence. In this regard, I would like to recall another author who doesn't get any attention in this thesis. I mean Andrei Bely, whose poetics is close to the one described in the reviewed work. His work is undoubtedly one of the links between Gogol and Sasha Sokolov. That's how it works, superimposing on each other, overflowing each other, live both objects and characters in the novel St. Petersburg. In Arbel's book, The Mastery of Gogol, such poetics is brilliantly described and reflexively described as a genetic related to Bely's own creative work. He writes, for example, about Gogol's pulls the complex of movements together, which reality is not about following the details of the subject, but about being faithful to the line of movement. And writes how Gogol plays with tricks of, like balls, throwing them from left to right, and from the foreground to the very depth of the horizon. And another edition, Dmitry Baranov writes about the introduction of the narrator-constructed reader into the world, as well as about the creation of an illusion of creating a text in front of the reader. It's about the features inherited by Sasha Sokolov from Gogol. But these features inherited by Gogol from Pushkin, primarily from Eugene Onegin, and by Pushkin from Byron, Lawrence Sterne, and Voltaire. And of course, I don't want to say that the candidate should have to trace all those chains of succession to which many others could be added. I just want to point out that Gogol's texts, perfectly analyzed in his thesis, are not only a reference point for Sasha Sokolov. It should be emphasized that my editions are not criticism. On the contrary, they are evidence of the productivity of this research, which encourages consideration of the new connection. However, I also have two small comments to the first part of the work. One of them is that it's in vain, in my opinion, Gogol's the author speaks of transition of Gogol to realistic convention. The thesis about Gogol's realism seems to be completely wrong. However, this has nothing to do with the central subject of the study. My second remark is related to the unsuccessful, in my opinion, use of the term the subject line, which denotes not only this is in the level of speech of the hearers and the author. The very distinction between these two levels is certainly productive, but this subject line includes both the actual subjects and such realities of the text as, for example, its characters, what somehow shocks when reading the thesis. However, I must admit that I couldn't find an adequate replacement for this term myself. In general, the first chapter creates a vivid experience of the reality of the literary text as an independent living organism, moving. It's even one even wants to say breathing, clearly develop in the process of its perception. I can't express anything but gratitude for such an experience as a reader. The second part of the work is devoted to the work of Sergey Dovlatov, whose poetics is based on an absolutely different base. The author emphasizes certain similarities between the two authors and their strategies. First of all, the attempt to problematize communication, but most importantly, demonstrates difference in the nature of narration of the two authors. The word in the novel by Sasha Sokolov has a life of its own, and the word of Sergey Dovlatov is oriented inward and outward, and we constantly balance on the border between one and the other. The poetics of Dovlatov is based on the presumption of distrust in language, including the language of artistic creation, the actually between the signified and the signified, as well as on a carefully camouflaged desire to restore this link. The communication task of the reader is to catch such desire, to perceive the ways of restoring this broken connection. From the study of Dmitry Kirillovich, it becomes clear why Dovlatov goes to this seemingly quite natural goal in some secret and obvious ways at first sight. The reason for this is in his rejection, even the theory of what the thesis calls a performative language. This means a language developed by the Soviet culture, which gives the names to the existing language. The work shows that such a language is inherent not only in the official but also in the dissident discourse. Such language, which has broken the link between the signified and the signifying, causes a strong trust of Dovlatov that it follows the path to the restoration of this link, which is as far away from him as possible. I'd like to mention another peculiarity of Mr. Baranov's dissertation. It's distinguished not only by the closest, almost pedantic attention to the smallest details of the text, but also by the same attention to the works of critics and researchers involved who studied the works of Sasha, Sokolov and Sergey Dovlatov. But I want to emphasize that not even that, but that witty move which was used by the candidate when addressing these works. His research is focused on the reception problems, and the statements of all the authors who wrote about the authors on the study become the voices of the reference group, a test audience whose opinions are of great interest to Dmitry Baranov as the evidence of perception of the artistic texts. The conclusion of this is quite obvious. The thesis by Dmitry Kirillovich Baranov on the topic communication problems in the prose of Sasha, Sokolov and Dovlatov meets the basic requirements established by the order of the 1st of September 2016, number 6821/1 on the order of awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University. And the candidate, Baranov Dmitry Kirillovich, deserves to be awarded the degree of candidate of philology, specialization 10-0101 Russian literature. Clause 11 of the above said order has not been violated by the dissertation candidate. Thank you, Maria Naumovna. Let us give the floor to Doctor of Philology, represents Tallinn University, Estonia, Irina Zakharovna Berlabrovtseva, who's working with us in the remote interactive mode. I don't want what is mentioned already by my colleagues. So in my opinion, this is a very brave move because of the work of these authors perceived differently. And the interest and the meaning and the significance of it. And strangeness used by the critics, the perception of Dovlatov's criticism. This difference cannot be omitted by the author. First, the author suggests interaction between the reader and the recipient can be used working with other works focused on the game between which influenced Sasha Sokolov and Dovlatov directly. Here it would make sense to explain the similar audience. Is that really true? Even if that is not quite true, so what would be the differences? Agree, the second chapter, half of the 20th century, communication issues which can unite the author with the reader. I'd like to emphasize the big difference between the personality of ideal reader, these two authors. For the Vidensky Hars, this was an act of transcendence. Artistical, this act of transcendence which happens in the course of writing, of quoting. So this can be applied to both novels. and understanding of this process. And when the text occurs immediately in front of the reader, is literally analysis of the literature. In the first chapter, manifests the relevant of literature. The author is well familiar with the opinions and the scientific discourses, proves his opinion on depicting the problems of communication in Russian literature last decades of the 20th century. As one of the of Gogol's poetics, the author makes some small discoveries. In the School of Full Service, we're not talking about the images of classes and social groups. As should be noted that Sokolov hints at the game with the Gogol's comedy, as is the game that prompts Sokolov to name one of the most important heroes, the postman Mikhail. This hero is born to accidental combination of the two characters in the same sentence. The postmaster is exactly our departmental watchman Mikhail. He must be a scoundrel who drinks badly. I emphasize this subtle remark is made in passing, which indicates there are many such findings. In his analysis of the School for Fools, Dmitry Baranov places the principle of leitmotif structure of suggested by Gasparov for an analysis. Is unity between reality, creation of illusions. Here I'm quoting Gasparov. There's been loss of learning between the world is analyzes, especially the second epigraph, a list of verbs, exception for members. He defines the high significance of these verbs. I'm quoting, they accumulate the motive system of the novel and point to certain events, help us to reconstruct the plot and the plot of the text. As a remark to Chapter 1, I will cite the strangely formal conclusions of Chapter 1.4. I'm quoting, of course, to some extent, all that can be considered fictional to the same extent. For example, that here graduate school, I find around related to the episode reference as influence Akhatov. The other day he looks around and lowers his voice into a whisper. I invented something. Follow me, it's in the barn. I now locked it up and leave in the barn. It's more convenient, takes more space. With Vasily Aksionov's story, Wild, 1965, where a strange invented by some classmate narrator, external engine. Listening to that, the engine is located in a barn. Let me proceed to the second chapter dedicated to poetics of Dovlatov. As already mentioned, the reception of creativity is far from certain. Paradoxically, this is reflected in the dissertation wording. In this chapter, there are many so-called general places, in my opinion, which occur precisely because of the ambivalence of creativity of Dovlatov. For example, comparing the preserve to Eugene Onegin. Citing Yuri Lotman, the contradiction is only one of the elements of the poetic system. This, I think, this comment was used as using contradictions, but I don't think that Pushkin had this idea of interrupted communication. Existing studies, exhaustive picture, don't know all the researchers studying Dovlatov's work. As the success of communication is achieved through the depicted world is recognized by the reader. Also, as Dmitry Baranov justly says, the author gets the impression that speaking about Dovlatov as a writer, and continuing this idea, the candidate says that Dovlatov's writing is by reading into the world. In my opinion, this statement is wrong. In the second chapter, the candidate uses the same path of analysis, similar to Gasparov, but this one, it doesn't work. And as Gasparov says, loses his singularity. He cannot stay illusionary. Obviously, the limit of analysis is not the instrument to analyze Dovlatov's prose. Starts stating, so this wouldn't make Dovlatov happy. It becomes if the ordinary things make him happy. I have certain comments. Firstly, extremely lengthy procedure for Dovlatov's attitude towards dissidence movement, fortunately leads to the conclusion that today's vague term, which doesn't give an idea of what was understood in 1970s and early 19th, various definitions doesn't answer the question whether Dovlatov's dissidence is ironic or not. So what they call in the dissidence was considered, of course, with good reason, Sakharov, Kopelev, Marchenko, etc. In any social movement, there are many figures worthy of respect. And however, this is not specified in the paper. On the contrary, we are dealing simply with the statement of the fact of Dovlatov's irony as an element of ideological loaded discourse. The candidate says it would seem that this in 1990s enabled us to understand the Dovlatov writings. Such a conclusion is incorrect. This simplification is incorrect here. Speaking of Dovlatov's use of inaccurate quotes, the candidate could trace the role of these inaccuracies, since the Dovlatov generation is carried the right of high degree of semiosity of the quote. Thirdly, I quote, and finally, the place of the story's writing indicated in the end, New York, has its role. What is the role of this? For example, the poem Moskva and Petushki also end in an indication of the place of writing. Sheremetyevo Lobnya, autumn 1969. Is the role of the place comparable in these two cases? Fourthly, the process of searching for the points of contact between Dovlatov and the Russian literature. The candidate finds that Dovlatov's comparison with Chekhov is begging for it, and on several grounds at once. They are both storytellers. Humor plays an important role for both of them. Both are connected with mass literature. What does mean anyway? And it's possible to compare qualities with almost all humorists. As a suggestion, I would like to draw the attention to the fact that the weightless silence is present to the core. Typically Platonic, and seems to me explains the literature of pre-Dovlatov art. Summing up, on chapter 2, the author runs into a serious challenge. So the work of Dovlatov is explained not only from aesthetic author's text, but from criticism. Dovlatov's and the main character of the preserve is but just an equal participant in the dialogue, which is unclear. But this problem is beyond the declared theme, and the promising note, which volume 1, which I see of the thesis presented for defense, will be eventually be answered. In conclusion, I would like to note that Dmitry has deep erudition in the theoretical aspect of literary criticism, filigree analysis, like Sokolov's novel School for Fools, which represents serious contribution to the study of this work, and bold attempt to compare the works of two Russian writers of 1970s and 1980s. These remarks do not negate the fact that they are of an outstanding thesis. Dmitry Baranov's thesis, Communication Problems in the Throes of Sasha Sokolov and Sergey Dovlatov, submitted for the degree of candidate philology, meets the basic requirements established by the, on the 1st of September 2016 on the procedure for ordinary academic research at Petersburg University. And the candidate, Dmitry Baranov, deserves the degree of candidate of philology, specialty 10-0101, the Russian literature. Clause 11 of the above-mentioned order has not been violated. Thank you. Irina Zakharovna. Now, let us follow the procedure. It's my turn to give my review, summarizing what was mentioned by my colleague. I can say that the subject theme is novel. This field, the authors of the aspect of communicative analysis. That is why the thesis has novelty, and a number of scientific tasks are relevant in today's for today's studies. It fills in the gap. The relevance is explained by the need to systematize the ideas about the broad communication literary text in order to create a holistic theoretical model, as well as to develop the principles of analysis of poemedicist narrative texts. The topic of the thesis corresponds to its specialty, and the problem is perspective of studying the theory and history of the Russian literature. The material of Sasha Sokolov's work, as well as Sergey Dovlatov's prose, chosen as the object of research, is very difficult to study, as the postmodernist text provides an opportunity for multiple written and multi-level interpretation. Therefore, a methodology should play a special load as the basis for such analysis should be mentioned. Researchers have outlined some fundamental approaches to the study of communication problems in postmodernist prose. These were pointed out by the author of the thesis in the course of the study, summarized by the author as the starting points for the development of the fundamental principles of analysis. But the methodological approach chosen by the author of the study allows to significantly deepen the planned approaches of his predecessor and to outline new and critical important ones. The methodology is based on the methods of communicative analysis, post-structuralism, and receptive aesthetics, which are enriched by the principles of narrative analysis as well as the methods of intertextual and motivational analysis of the text, the methodology of Bakhtin, and the experience of modern analysis of postmodernist texts. These methods and principles of analysis are demonstrated in the context of the study in the two chapters: the meaning dynamics of Sasha Sokolov's novel, A School for Fools, and Poetics by Dovlatov, the story already preserved in light of problem communication. The complexity of such analysis demonstrated by the rather representative composition of the chapters based on the identification of almost a dozen special issues. For example, we can make such problems as the problematization of the plot and the character, the blurring of the boundaries between the character and the world, the role of epigraphs, species, the semantic center, the motive of the voice, its role, the category of game, and others. The second chapter is dedicated to the study of other kinds of problems. Their change when considering Dovlatov's novel and their preserve shows dynamics of this research point of view. Let's name only the main problems identified in the titles of the paragraphs. The image of Dovlatov as an abstract or specific author for a contemporary reader, an idiot and an ideologue writer. Category of reality, Dovlatov's prose, Dovlatov's the work and the life of the performative shift, pre-Dovlatov's dialogue, the system of leitmotifs, and etc. Such structuring makes it possible to understand the logic of research and the difference between the types of communication in the two works. At the same time, analysis of the work, whether the two rather complicated works of Sasha Sokolov and Dovlatov are connected by the same single metatextual formation appearing at the intersection of the author and the hero's consciousness and actualized in the reader's consciousness. We mean the metatext elements that perform mainly structuring and communicative functions in the text. The concept of metatext has been actualized nowadays in the study of modern literature, especially postmodernist literature. In general, the analysis of the arises, no doubt. In the course of such analysis, the author manages to prove convincingly, with the variation of a number of motives such as Sokolov's novel, The School for Fools, contributes to the development of semantic dynamics of the work, and the reader can understand it as a development of the lyrical plot. Following the tradition of Gogol, as convincingly demonstrated by the author, problematizes the category of the character, and the semantic structure reflects the communicative situation, the system of epigraphs, and creates a system of relations between different elements of the text and motives, gives the opportunity for equal interpretation of the final novel. In Dovlatov's prose, as the analysis has shown, communication problems arrive both at the level of the subject world and in the interaction of the reader with the text. The process of reading and receiving the artwork here is one of those to overcome the communication barrier. Therefore, not only solution of the communication, but also actively involves the reader in the game of documentalism, which allows blurring the boundaries between the text and reality. The author convincingly analyzes strategies and their connection with the aspects of communication. For example, it shows that in Dovlatov's novel, The Preserve, the change in the attitude of the hero to the world and to the creative work coincides the reader's re-evaluation of the text just read. The strategy of violating the boundaries of the narrative instances is used. An important conclusion made in the process of the analysis is that the selection of the narrative strategy as the way of the reader's consciousness is the most productive way to analyze texts based on the principles of game. Therefore, the author problematizes the process of text communication to solve the problem of its understanding. At the same time, while reading this thesis, I got some comments that should be explained. For example, it would be important to clarify some of the terms used, whether the researcher has new tools or is metaphorizing concepts. For example, the narrating world, pages 67, 137, 141, and the narrated world, page 169, as well as the level of narrating world or the level of narration. The word communication is used very often and not entirely justified. One of the shortcomings of the work is the carelessness of the word, in some cases, as the postmodernist speech manner of speaking of selected writers apparently has set and has impacted both the style and manner of speech of the candidate. There are sentences metaphorical and metonymic meanings and repetitions of word combinations. I will not give you any examples here. In general, the thesis under consideration presents a fairly representative and fruitful scientific concept. The theoretical significance is in the systematization of approaches to the analysis of problem communication and development of its integral model of the works in modern literature, which allows a more complete and in-depth description of the narrative poetry of the Russian postmodernist literature. The results of the work are of interest for the study of the theory of communication analysis and models of their creation by various authors. The experience of this research can be taken into account in the course of further development of models of text in literature. The practical significance searches into where the results can be let Ms. Rish, the author, to continue his study of Russian literature. The thesis demonstrates both a thorough knowledge of sources and materials and scientific approaches to their analytical consideration. The questions and comments do not diminish importance of the study, which deserves high praise. On the subject thesis, there's a necessary number of publications in scientific journals, including the list of Russian international citation databases. The thesis by Dmitry Baranov, Communication Problems in the Prose of Sasha, Sokolov and Sergey, submitted for the degree of Candidate of Philology, Specialization 10-0101, Russian Literature, meets the basic requirements established on the 1st of September 2016, number 6821/1 of the Order of Awarding Academic Degrees at the Petersburg University. And the candidate, Baranov Dmitry Kirillovich, deserves to be awarded the degree of Candidate of Philology, Specialization 10-0101, Russian Literature. Clause 11 of the above-mentioned order has not been violated by the candidate. Thank you for your attention. And now let's give the floor to the applicant to answer questions. First of all, dear members for studying my thesis carefully. That will help me. When I read the response to Irina Zakharova, it took about half an hour, and I have much less time in total, so I had to remove many considerations. But some comments I did not answer in detail. If the answers seem insufficient, I will be happy to provide additional information. Let me start with answering a review of Alexander Olegovich, which does not contain any specific, doesn't have any ask any specific questions, and not all the specific features of Sokolov's poetry, not immediately. And the nature of Sokolov's poetics is quite interesting. Let's proceed to the review by Maria Naumovna. There's a realism of Gogol. I absolutely agree with her opinion, but I never called Gogol a realist, and following the example of Philology, interaction between the author, they call he is realistic. Following the terminology of my predecessor, I understand that the word realistic is not used in the traditional sense here, but let me use the traditional terminology here. A second comment, the subject line. I agree, but I could not find. I totally agree with Maria Naumovna. Page 21, the phrase subject line, which I borrowed from the work of Roman Ingarden. I say is the subject line can hardly be applied to the School for Fools, and further is a traditional wording, because we don't have a better wording. And in conclusion, I'd like to thank Maria Naumovna, and in addition for how you managed summarize the key points of my subject. I couldn't have done so coherently in my own head. Thank you. Further, I'd like to answer questions about Svetlana Dmitrievna. Svetlana says that some terms need clarification as questions if I'm using new instruments or metaphorizing concepts. This question applies to wording, narrating word, narrated word, level of narrating word. I wouldn't say that I'm using new instruments. The term narrating word, which I use as a synonym to depicted word, I use traditionally from the structuralist narratology, in full agreement with the well-known model of communicative levels of Wolf Schmid. Well, anything related to characters, space and time depicted in the character in generally subject line. The term narrating word I use when speaking about the narrator and the depicted word, using Schmidt terminology, which is not included in the depicted word. I also use such wording for certain consistency, because working with the preserved, narrated I and narrating I, and I have to emphasize the difference between two levels. Also, Svetlana Dmitrievna is a careless wording. Here I cannot say nothing, just say thank you to Svetlana Dmitrievna that I have to be more careful with my wording. Let me answer review of Dmitrievna is the word followed by the reader, and well, this statement is true not only Dovlatov and Sokolov, but I have never argued with that. In narrative strategy can mean anything, and not necessarily writers describing these dynamics. Some readers but Dmitry, the idea of text creation, the reader exercise its own freedom is not. I don't claim anywhere that Sokolov is unique in this regard, simply because of the cultural context and poetics of his novel School for Fools. The idea is particularly relevant. Next, we should turn to the topic of terminology. Of course, it was possible to use the terminology of, say, Shklovsky or Lotman. But it must be said that in research, there are different terminological instruments to greater or less degree suitable for the description of the communicative process. I simply didn't find myself in the process of writing material where I could not formulate a thought where I turn into some other terminology that and since there's no need for this, it's not necessary to stipulate in the research how the content of this could be expressed in other words from the standpoint of other terminological systems. And finally, Lyubov Dmitrievna emphasizes, notes that literature is too much literature and some authors not been dropped from the list. It's never possible to take out absolute all literature. So it's necessary to stop. And there's always a probability to omit some little-known, hard-to-reach works. The only consolation here is that I have read, I hope, all the great research monographs devoted to Dovlatov's poetics and School for Fools. I've got acquainted with all the main articles. I've always paid attention to the list of literature. If there's any work, well, it's not referred or rarely referred to in modern research, and one can be sure that this work has not made a breakthrough at science. As for literature in foreign languages, I understand why they pay such attention to in other theses, but I don't want to artificially increase the list of literature. Everything should be used only as needed. Naturally, if the thesis had been dedicated to some foreign language author, I would have had to read mainly foreign language literature. However, when it comes to the Russian-speaking author, pay special attention to the level of language. It's obvious that the Russian-speaking works shall be more important here. The exception is Laura Simon's work, but it was also published in Russian at the same time as the Italian version. I've taken into account the own language on Dovlatov, the book by Tirina Young, as indicated, its content does not exceed the limits of this general place of Russian. Of course, with the situation with such Sokolov difference, since the School for Fools was published, became living classics. Foreign scientists began to study it. However, in 1990, when the novel was studied in Russia, first thing in paper, it was work summarizing conclusions of the studies existing abroad. Since I was not involved in the reception of the novel or the history of its study, it didn't matter to me who wrote this first, for example, about the motive of the wind as the Holy Spirit, Lipovetsky or Button Johnson. I was mostly interested in the current degree of study of the novel, although I did take into account the work of many English-speaking researchers. To be honest, I didn't know about the existence of researchers Lyubov Dmitrievna had pointed out. However, to some extent, this is indicative in itself. Since the publication of these reviews, I have, of course, tried to learn something about these scientists. As far as I understand, Sokolov is not the main object of research by Cynthia Simmons. It seems that she only has one monograph dedicated not specifically to Sokolov, but also to Yereseyev, Limonov, Aksonov. Judging by the fact that this work, published in 1996, is not referred to modernist by Sokolov, it's unlikely this book will turn over the idea of the author. As for Elena Kravchenko, she has a small monograph on Sokolov's poetics, which indeed is a chapter of School for Fools. I haven't had time to read the whole text yet, but I have read the conclusion, which Kravchenko writes, summarizing up the analysis, frankly speaking, is a set of almost very common places. The novel in which everything unfolds only at the level of language, the novel which doesn't just reflect reality, but creates a special world, the protagonist, creative consciousness. All this in one way or the other has already been mentioned. However, of course, I will study these works in detail, because in any work there can be something extremely important. And finishing my answer, I can only thank you, Lyubov Dmitrievna, for pointing out to me the existence of this study and reminding that there never comes a moment they can have to say to myself, okay, I've read everything, which can be said about this author. And finally, I'd like to comment on the review of Irina Zakharovna. In the second chapter, the author uses same motives, as just same path of analysis, such as money, alcohol, but in this case, the leitmotiv doesn't work. As page 201, that this is so we have the of harmfulness of alcohol. I allowed to disagree with neither the general part of the remark nor the private one. I'll start with the specific one. The statement that alcohol is simply negative in this story does not arise as an independent thesis. It's just a starting point. On the next page, 242, I know there's only one side of the motive of alcohol, but in fact it has an ambivalent color. Of course, we can say that this is typical for both Dovlatov prose and the prose of many authors of uncensored literature. However, I take a review of static modes of preserve money alcohol in order to emphasize the importance of the dynamical development motive of fake creativity against this background. As for the overall productivity of the motivational analysis, including those including those take place in less than custom form, makes it possible to understand many important prose and for example, on pages in the 185, and well, this as Dovlatov's principal position, this cannot be true. I will skip for the examples. No less productive, in my opinion, is the study of the leitmotif structure of a particular text. For example, on pages 262, 266, I state that in the finale of the preserve, the author overcomes the craving for puns by replacing the word love, which has lost its meaning, with the appropriate word destiny. In order to demonstrate the word love loses its meaning, I have to turn to the analysis of a context. I reminded that semantic sport, maybe according to same Gasparov, is also a word. A number of examples can be continued. I don't quite understand how leitmotif cannot work. I think this is rather a universal tool. Another thing, that in different works, indeed, different features of the structure of the text will not be involved in different degrees. And of course, the motive system of school is much more extensive than that of Dovlatov. But that's why the work by Dovlatov is by no means reduced to motivational analysis, as well as the work of School for Fools. And, well, next question, Irina Zakharovna says, the names of two authors given in tandem suggest that the readership is similar. Is that so? No. In fact, the can be applied to next following comment. In my opinion, the dissertation places too much emphasis on the absence of any educational beginning of such Sokolov, even agreeing with this statement, we should note that such a creative attitude is not uncommon and cannot be specific mark of these authors, except in comparison with the literature of the 19th century. As the candidate does, speaking about the difference between Sokolov and Gogol. Yes, the emphasis of an instructive point of Sokolov's prose is made precisely when talking about Sokolov plays with Gogol's tradition. As for Dovlatov, the emphasis here is not on the absence of the author from the others, but to understand the peculiarities of the reception of Dovlatov's prose. That is, an emphasis has not been made. It's not been for the attempts for both ordinary readers and researchers to reduce the creative potential of the Dovlatov text to moralizing. I will allow myself to mention a large number of examples from critical and scientific works. The next remark, Irina Zakharovna notes that in the produces following passage, adequate reading of Dovlatov's works is possible. Adequate reading of Dovlatov's work is possible only if they are enough attention. It's a culture of Dovlatov's times. After that, Irina Zakharovna writes, it is unnecessary to say that this statement is relevant to the works of almost any author. Without due attention of a literary critic reader, an adequate reading is impossible in any case. However, in this fragment of the text, I'm not saying that without due attention, adequate reading is impossible. I'm saying that without due attention to specific peculiarities of the text, an adequate reading is impossible. The Dovlatov texts are very easy to read, as it usually happens, without paying the slightest attention to the way the theme of communication is presented, or to how exactly the relationship between the text and the implicit reader is built. Irina Zakharovna also gives an example of commonplace by mentioning the existing researchers do not give an exhaustive picture of Dovlatov's poetics. Irina Zakharovna rightly points out that there are no cases of complete exhaustion of the study of any writer's work in principles. However, I will allow myself to cite the whole sentence quoted by Irina Zakharovna. Existing scientific research does not give an exhaustive picture of Dovlatov. They don't fully consider how the poetics. Maybe my wording was bad. I didn't use the. This is the most successful, but the wording. And moreover, in the next sentence, I said there's no dominant view on Dovlatov's prose inside. This really distinguishes it from many other authors. not about the degree of study, but about the lack of agreement among the researchers. Finally, Irina Zakharova writes that the comparison of their preserved Eugene Onegin also seems to be close to the general is very commonplace, not only because of the modern author to the Pushkin novel, but also because of the attraction of Lotman's comment. Let me disagree. Comparison of preserve and Eugene is a commonplace, but the comparison between the preserve by Lotman can be considered controversial. It's no coincidence that I only put forward the corresponding hypothesis, but definitely not a commonplace, as it was not made. I don't have time to comment in detail on Dovlatov principle of contradictions, and whether I really think Eugene Onegin has a theme of communication problem. Yes, I think this theme is present in Eugene Onegin, as I say on page 6. Let me move on. Final remark by Irina Zakharova. Performative shift. This is not formulated in the form of a specific question, but I will try to give a brief comment. I didn't aim to determine what dissidence was and made a number of relevant research reservations. In her response, Marina Ivanovna noted I was interested in the work of the researchers of prose, including how to read this prose. As a material for research that should be meaningful, Dovlatov dissidence is often said to be groundless. I will keep the examples. My task was not so much to argue with my opponents as to understand where this viewpoint might come from and what it might be related to. The next common question, Irina Zakharova writes, speaking of Dovlatov's use of inaccurate quotes, that the candidate could trace the role of this inaccuracy, since Dovlatov's generation is characterized by a high degree of semioticity of the quote. Maybe I don't quite understand the question, but the global role of inaccurate quoting, as also noted on page 188, this is how the idea, the literal text, I also noted, so often explained by the context. On page comment says, next question quotes a sentence from her thesis. And finally, the place of the story's right in New York also plays its role. Then she asks a question. What exactly is the role of this indication? And then, is this indication comparable, for example, to the indication of a place of writing in the poem Moscow Petushki? I will allow myself to continue the quote from my thesis. The place of writing indicated in the end of the story also plays its role. As a result, there is an attempt to combine the fictitious and real world even more. Probably, I didn't emphasize the idea enough. In the preserve, the boundary between the artistic text and external reality is rather blurred, and in the eyes of a naive reader, the hero and narrator correlate with a particular author. Throughout the story, the hero pondered whether he should follow his wife. In the final, naive reader, who perceives the hero as real Dovlatov and vice versa, sees that the story is written in New York and cannot but complete the text, assuming that hero eventually decided to emigrate. Thus, formally, the indication of the place of writing is usually beyond the artistic text. Is external information, such as says, is in case of preserve, this information is on the border of external reality and the text, and because, as I said, works to undermine this border. The next common question, Irina Zakharova writes, while searching for the points of contact between Dovlatov and the Russian literature, the candidate finds that Lola's comparison with Chekhov begs for it, and on several grounds at once. Both of them are storytellers, both of them have an important role of humor, both are somehow connected with the mass literature. What does they mean anyway? Does it seem to be that dissertation attributes can be compared with almost all humorists? I agree with Irina Zakharova. Of course you can. However, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that Irina Zakharova quotes the text of the footnote, and I will allow myself to continue this quote. Both are connected with mass literature. Dovlatov's desire to resemble Chekhov is also known, and even in annotations on the back cover, the last pocket-sized collections of ABC classics, as detailed comparison of the two authors calls for a separate study. But now we are only interested in the general idea of the problem of communication, the idea of Chekhov's successor in the principles of the hero's principles of hero construction is reflected in a monograph by Somkin. Also in connection between poet Dovlatov and Chekhov is noted in a number of works. I call these works of Dobrazhravskaya and Plotnikova, but this can be continued. Thus, I'm not looking for points of contact with the Russian classics, but on the contrary, I'm explaining why I'm not distracted in my thesis by the idea that comes to the mind at once. The connection with Chekhov has already become a commonplace in Saty's works, and I try to avoid this commonplace. In conclusion, I'd like to thank Irina Zakharovna, first of all, for the fact that thanks to your feedback, I realized that it always clearly and correctly accentuates certain moments in my thesis, which is why many thoughts disappear or can be interpreted in a different way. Secondly, I'm grateful for an indication of an opportunity to compare one of the moments of the School of Fools with Aksionov's story and to look for the origin of the language into Platonov's prose. I will certainly think about that. Thank you once again. Thank you. Thank you. Does anyone have questions? Do the attendees have questions? Does anyone present here want to speak? No one has any question and no one wants to speak. Then let's give the floor to the academic advisor, Doctor of Philology, Professor of Department of History of Russian Literature, Andrei Dmitryevich Stepanov. First of all, I'd like to mention that Dmitry Kirillovich became a student in 2014, and his first academic advisor for 2 years was Professor Vladimir Markovich. After he passed away, I became the academic advisor of the candidate. The work of Dmitry Kirillovich is based on a serious theoretical base, shows thorough knowledge of literature, a skill to create concepts and conduct scientific dialogue. The cornerstone of his study, the principles, the existence of a fictional text closely connected with communication. And in the introduction, the author says that one of the possible relations between text and external world is studied, and in addition to that, the candidate relies on structural poetics, formalist theories, post-structural theories, and studies by Bakhtin. The work consists of introduction, 2 chapters, and conclusion. And the structure of the thesis seems logical. The first chapter is dedicated to the novel by Sasha Sokolov, School for Fools, shows where the main character has problems interacting with others, explores the process of communication. And when speaking literary text as an expression, Sasha Sokolov explores the code as a communication context, because the reader has to apply additional effort to reconstruct the line of object. And the text it's hard to perceive the text because the novel is full of difficult communicative situations. The author claims that poetics is achieved not through traditional plot development, but through a complex communicative system, which is more typical for poetry. Description of Sokolov's novel to be found in the first chapter. The author believes that while reading the text, the reader creates the text itself. So he expresses his freedom. This freedom is expressed in the possibility to choose one of the interpretations of the finale of the text, can escape the non-free world. And the second option is impossible, the possibility of such escape in the socialist culture. The second chapter is dedicated to Dovlatov poetics. Baranov demonstrates how the author tries to blur boundaries of literary text using documents. As a result, such elements of communicative such as code and context are explored. This recognition effect is achieved not through authenticity, but through the effort. The reader recognizes behavior of the characters. The candidate relies on Yurchenko ideas that when ritualized, the person runs with many rituals in his everyday life. So this deviation between form and meaning is one of the main communicative problems. The main character realizes this problem, but he has to follow the same rituals as the other characters. The speech is discredited. Yet, as the candidate demonstrates, some characters try to rethink their attitude to the word. The thesis demonstrates how the main character of the Preserves deals with this issue, and the external reality, how can be perceived as an event that may affect the real world. In conclusion, the author summarizes the results in his work. I think the work is well explained. The results have been presented at international conferences and published in articles. The thesis has been discussed by the expert group, and a novelty because there are no major studies dedicated on how communicative problems in the end of the 20th century have been reflected in the fiction. Texts of Sokolov and Dovlatov have not been studied. The study has a theoretical value, conceptualizes problematics of the two leading authors of the end of the 20th century, late 20th century. Description of direction by the recipient can be used work with other studying the works of other texts. Dmitry Baranov, well, a clever, thorough researcher, and I have no doubt that in the future he has a great future as a researcher. And I think that his thesis, problems of texts of communication, the text of Sasha, Sokolov, is a valuable piece of research. It contributed a lot to the study of Russian literature in the second half of the 20th century. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Now time has come for our discussion. So anyone who's not please stop online broadcasting, and anyone who's not a member of the Dissertation Council, please leave the council room for 3-5 minutes. We will ask you to come back after our discussion is over.
Заседание продолжается. Прошу включить звуковое сопровождение трансляции
Resume the meeting and resume broadcasting. Please make sure we are on air. Please make sure we are on air. I now put the awarding of the academic degree to the open individual vote. Let me remind you that the decision of the Dissertation Council shall be considered positive if more than a half, but not less than 3 members of the Council taking part in the session voted for it in accordance with Article 23 of the procedure for awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University. I will address members of the Council now. Alexander Olegovich Bolshev, what is your opinion? Do you agree? Yes, I agree. Thank you. Lyubov Dmitrievna Bugaeva, your opinion? Yes, I agree to award. I think the degree should be awarded. Maria Naumovna Virolainen. Yes, I think that Dmitry Kirillovich deserves the degree. Irina Zakharovna, your opinion, please. I believe the candidate deserves the degree. Thank you. And myself, I also believe that Dmitry Kirillovich Baranov deserves the degree of candidate of philology, specialty 10-0101 Russian literature. Thus, dear colleagues and guests, let me announce that out of 5 members of the Council participating in the meeting, 5 voted for, no one voted against, and no one abstained. And we decided to award the degree of Doctor of Philology, Specialization 10-0101 Russian literature, to Baranov Dmitry Kirillovich. Let's give the floor to the applicant for his final word. And for the summary, let's give the floor to the candidate for his final word. In conclusion of today's meeting, I'd like to express gratitude to all the to everyone. In one form, I would like to thank all the professors of the Department of History, Russian Literature. I'm sincerely convinced that our department was the best literary education, and the key to success, in my opinion, is not only the highest level of the professors, but their personal interest in the education and scientific process, and most importantly, in students and their activities. It's a pity there's I don't have a possibility to name everyone, but I would especially like to thank Elena Nikolaevna Grigorieva, who was for a long time co-led the seminar Classics and Avant-Garde, to whom I gave many years, which I'm very glad. I would also like to thank my family and friends who supported me and thought that everything I do makes sense. I'm also grateful to all those who came to the defense today, who are watching the broadcast and therefore interested in what is happening. I'd like to thank once again distinguished members of the Dissertation Council who have not only carefully studied my work, but also entered fruitful scientific discussion with me and pointed some drawbacks of my work. And finally, I'd like to thank my academic advisor, Andrei Dmitryevich Stepanov. I'd like to thank you for your attention, valuable advice and guidance, and a special thank Andrei Dmitryevich for agreeing to suddenly pick up a third-year graduate student who needed urgently change the topic of his thesis. In conclusion, I'd like to say that everything would not have happened if it hadn't been for Vladimir Markovich, who had been my supervisor for 8 years. It's not just that Vladimir Markovich directly influenced the formation of my interests. And if I had approached someone else in my first year, I would have dealt with different themes. I am grateful to Vladimir Markovich for the fact that he has defined for me what's humanities in general and what it should be and how it should work. So if it were not for Vladimir Markovich, I would never be who I am now. Thank you once again to everyone present. Thank you. The session is closed. We thank everybody for taking part in it. Please stop online broadcasting.